Good evening and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Pickthall House's inaugural discussion. My name is Mustafa Warsi, and I'm Chairman and Non-Executive Director of Pickthall House. Pickthall House is a new non-partisan think tank based in London aimed at providing research and policy recommendations to help realign Britain to its true long-term aims, both foreign and domestic. On foreign affairs, our research aims to identify new diplomatic approaches with strategically important regional powers, encouraging trade, building British resilience in a changing world order. Domestically, we aim to address the rapid demographic changes caused by an aging population and immigration, and look for new and effective approaches to multiculturalism and social cohesion. If you're interested in finding out more, or working together perhaps on policy research, or just shooting the breeze, please find me after the talk, or one of us, and or alternatively visit www.pickthallhouse.org. Now, on to our event for the evening. Our guest needs little introduction, but I'll try my best anyway. Peter Hitchens has been a major contributor to conservative discourse in this country for decades, championing Burkeanism and ideas of social democracy. He's faced the ire of both the left and right-wing commentariat in response to his unapologetically original political analysis, shedding light on issues far beyond what is considered addressable within the Overton window. This makes him interesting. He currently writes for The Mail on Sunday, but has contributed to The Spectator, The Guardian, The American Conservative, The New Statesman, and many, many others. He's the author of many notable books, most saliently for us today, The Broken Compass, on how the left and right no longer maintain strong social convictions, but instead are simply vying for the center, thereby presiding over a steady British decline. It's a fascinating read. I do totally independently and personally recommend you guys check it out. Talking with him, we have Faiz Ahmed on the far right, no pun intended, who directs foreign affairs work here at Pickthall House, and is a businessman based out of London working in the soft commodity import and export trade. And we have Jacob Williams here in the center, who directs domestic and cultural research at Pickthall House, and is a DPhil candidate here at Oxford, working in the intersection of religion, culture, and politics. The discussion today, as you guys all know, is titled Religion, War, and Britain's Broken Political Compass. And I hope you enjoy listening to it as much as we enjoyed organizing it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Peter, we'll begin with a discussion on some domestic political issues, and then Fez will ask a few questions about foreign policy, and then we'll open up to audience questions at the end. So, Peter, in the late 2000s, you argued that the Conservative Party had come to embrace a Blairite agenda of social and cultural liberalism, while the Labour Party had aligned itself with neoconservative causes like the war on terror. And today we still see Labour lining up behind wars in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, while the Conservatives have hardly become a party of traditional Christian values. So for the benefit of viewers who might still believe the competition between the two parties is vital and important, how would you describe the underlying ideology they both share, and what in your view is wrong with that ideology?
Well, the Conservative Party does not have an ideology. The Conservative Party remains what it has always been, an organisation for obtaining office for the sons of gentlemen. That's all it is. It never had any politics, and by not being the Labour Party for many years, it formed a sort of opposition and brake on the Labour Party. But the more the Labour Party became ideological and dogmatic, which it began really to do in a big way in the 1960s, and in an even bigger way in the 1990s, the more the Conservative Party, by failing to have any kind of ideology, had to pretty much accept, without understanding, almost everything that Labour did. This mattered a bit in the 1960s, particularly. People are often now very rude about Harold Wilson's 1964 to 70 government, because Wilson himself was such an unprincipled and uninspiring man. And these are not things I support, but the social revolution encompassed by that government, particularly under the Home Secretary Roy Jenkins in terms of the removal of the principle of punishment from criminal justice, the end really of Christian marriage by the creation of what has turned into no-fault divorce, the introduction likewise of what has turned into pretty much inevitably abortion on demand, and the colossal revolution in education in which merit was almost entirely removed from the education system to such an extent that the examination system of the British secondary schools had to be inflated wildly to cover up the consequences of it, and has been inflated ever more wildly every year since, as have university degrees. So these are huge things which Labour did. And when the Conservatives came back into office in 1970, they didn't understand them, they made no effort to reverse any of them. And then you got, in 1997, the arrival of a Labour Party which was more or less a Euro-communist party. I don't know how familiar people are with this, but basically this is what happened in 1968. The European left. In 1968, the European left had a revolution of the mind caused by two events. One, the Paris 1968 riots, which were basically about sex, and the other, the crushing by the Soviet Union of the Prague Spring, which was basically about people on the left realizing that they could no longer even conjure up a glimmer of sympathy for Soviet communism, and the traditional communist parties were dead. Out of this came, and I was part of it, a new wave of revolutionary leftism, which had little to do with the past, was much more to do with cultural, moral and sexual revolution, much more to do also with foreign policy, almost nothing to do with the conditions of the working class or the creation of a Bolshevik party. We weren't interested in capturing the post office and the barracks and the railway station anymore. We were interested in capturing the television station and the newspaper and the school and the university and the television studio and Hollywood. That's what we wanted to do, and we set out in the 1960s to do it, and by 1996 we had almost completely done this in this country, except the one thing we hadn't captured was government. And in 1997 the Euro-communist New Left captured government, and the response from the Conservative Party was, frankly, to stare at the whole thing as if it was a goldfish with its mouth hanging open. It had no idea what had hit it. It didn't object to it because it didn't know what was wrong with it, and it was then belaboured by the Labour Party over and over and over again while in government, until eventually it gave in and agreed that it would not reverse anything that the Blair government would do. I have never said, that I'm constantly misquoted as saying, that the Tory party is itself left-wing. It doesn't have any beliefs. The most Tory MPs and most influential people in conservatism don't have any substantial beliefs. They try to organise election victories, but they don't believe in anything. It's the Labour Party that believes in things, and it has achieved this extraordinary thing of browbeating its principal opponent into not opposing its main programme. And that is where we are. Now, the moment I can go on about this, or you might want to ask another question. At the moment, this leads to a very peculiar situation, because if the Labour Party wins the election later this year, I would suggest probably in the autumn, then you will get a very, very active Euro-Communist Party in office with a strong and directed programme of which we know almost nothing at the moment, under a leader who is actually quite a knowledgeable revolutionary who comes out of a tradition called Pabloism, which none of you will ever have heard of, but you will. That will be the position, and if they don't win, then we will continue to have, and those of you who read Aesop's fables will recognise this, you'll continue to have an incompetent, boring, lifeless government like that of King Log in the great fable, which will do much less damage because it doesn't have any direction. That's the choice before us in the coming election, between active, vigorous, ideological change and incompetent, slothful management of the change that's already happened.
It's very interesting in the narrative that you place most of the emphasis on the left as the generator of ideological change. Many people felt at the time, and perhaps still do feel, that in adopting ideas like the war on terror and particular attitudes towards national security, that Labour actually moved to the right on certain issues as well. Is there any truth in that, or is this a misunderstanding?
Well, I don't know. I haven't brought my political compass with me. It broke some time ago. If you have one handy, I'll borrow it and we'll try and find out. These terms don't mean anything. It's just when you have a government department which sets out to try and eradicate what it calls extremism. And now, of course, there are these attempts by the anti-terror organs to focus on something they call the far right. These terms have absolutely no meaning at all. They're simply things of which the current government and establishment disapprove. They can't say far left because nobody would understand what it meant anyway, and because quite a lot of them were themselves far left anyway. But they use these terms purely to frighten people. The war on terror is basically a collection of words meaning nothing, and has no significance. All it meant was that the claim to be lessening the risk of terrorism was used as a pretext for making the most profound attack on civil liberty in modern times. Whether that's right-wing or left-wing, I don't know. What I do know is that it's bad, because I think every living, breathing human being of any sense wants government to be less powerful rather than more powerful. I'll call it bad, but I won't call it right-wing, and I won't even call it left-wing either.
So on that topic of civil liberties and the general balance of cultural values in Britain, a recent event that many on the right supported was where the High Court upheld the ban at Michaela School on, in practice, mostly Muslim prayer rituals. And I noticed your view was quite...
No, I didn't support that. I mean, I like Catherine Berbel Singh, and I've been to her school, and I understand what she's trying to do. And although there are aspects of the school I personally like, I think she's done an awful lot of good for an awful lot of children, and I applaud that. And I think she is in a difficulty when people in that school try to introduce any changes which she doesn't control. But for someone like me who believes that schools should actually be, schools, as far as I'm concerned, are religious institutions. The whole idea that there are things which we ought to know, and that there are people whose authority we ought to listen to, that there is authority of any kind in the universe, whether authority of knowledge or authority of teachers, is a religious idea, and schools which don't have a religious foundation are going to struggle to explain to people where they get their authority to do what they do. And also, in any case, I think that a society which neglects the education of its children in religion neglects civilization. Ultimately, if we are not brought up to believe in God and in the created universe and the need to understand it, then I'm afraid that as a society we will disintegrate. And that's what I think. I know that not everybody believes that, and a lot of people disagree with me, but I cannot believe that and say that, and at the same time object to anybody who wants to introduce prayers into a state school, because it would be against my principles. That's why I didn't join it. I thought it would be utterly inconsistent with everything else I believe.
And that's a very interesting point, because there are many on the right, although that term may be meaningless, but there are many who identify as being on the right, who would say some of these things that you've just said about the value of religion, the need for a religious worldview, but would still invoke the principle of secularism when they feel it's useful to resist Islam in certain ways. What's your view on that?
Well, I just think it's a mistake. You have to make up your mind. I think that here I have to cope with a problem which always dogs me and is bound to do so, which is the position of my late brother on religion, which he was profoundly opposed to it, though he ultimately, pressed by my friend Doug Wilson, he said he wouldn't want religion to be wiped out of civilization. I think he had a hesitation about that, but nonetheless, but in his crossing over from the American left, the American anti-war, the American civil liberties left, to a qualified support of George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, which he must have found pretty uncomfortable, because he's not in any way a Republican or an American-type conservative. In the course of that, his life was made a lot easier by his adoption of a very, very militant critique of Islam, which a lot of the time spared him from having to say all that much about how much he disliked Christianity as well. Now, my view is this. I don't agree with many of the precepts of Islam. I've had a lot of enjoyment discussing this with Muslims, who in many cases, but not all, I regard as allies against secularism and immoralism in our society. But I also disagree with them. I disagree with them very strongly, particularly about the position of women in Islam, and a number of other things. I think these questions cannot be addressed by people who say, well, I hate you because you embrace another religion. You have to say, I disagree with you. And this is why I disagree with you, and this is why what my religion says is right. And what I also say is this: if Western societies don't fancy the idea of becoming Islamic, which I think is a real possibility, by the way, if they don't fancy the idea of becoming Islamic, they have to ask themselves what the alternative is. Now, I seem to remember the Blair creature at some point saying that, I know, the Taliban, they hate our way of life. And I watched him say this on television, and I shouted out to those people who were present with me in the room at the time, but I hate our way of life as well. Which I do. I think it's horrible, the godless, secular world in which the family is under violent and constant attack, and children are constantly being brought up by paid strangers and shoved into horrible schools where they're taught rubbish, and a place generally of consumerist immoralism, which I don't approve of. I do hate it. But I think the only answer to it is religion, and for me it's the Christian religion. But if our society does not wish to be Christian, then I think it will find in years to come, especially when the phantasm of endless growth is gone, and life is raw and difficult, and there are constant wars, and people begin to turn again to the most fundamental concerns of life. I think there will be a major religious revival in the West. And if Christianity isn't prepared to lead it, then somebody else will, and that will be nobody's fault. But both the leaders of Christianity who failed and the people who, when they had the opportunity to follow what was the religion of their forefathers, didn't follow it. So they can't complain. But I think the anti-Islamic posture of the right is incredibly empty because it offers no alternative. And also, of course, it has an unpleasant undertow in it, where I think by attacking Islam, it tries to suggest, I'm not even going to be explicit here because I don't want to encourage it, it tries to suggest that there's another concern it wants to join in with. You'll have to work out what I mean and who I mean yourselves.
On the point of this anti-Islamic posture, there is, of course, this tendency over the last 10 to 15 years of this government to do more and more to impose a set of so-called British values on schools and civil society, to counter so-called non-violent extremism, positions that are not actually illegal but might be outside of the mainstream. What's your view on this?
Well, aren't they funny, these principles? They're all about how to claim benefits and how to sing Jerusalem, and they have no content. These things which you're supposed to do, I think I haven't looked at it lately, but the sort of citizenship test things that you have to pass, they're all comic book. It's unfair. So Ladybird books, which were in many cases quite profound in comparison to say that it's a Ladybird version of patriotism, but that's what it is. They don't really themselves believe in this country, its nature, its history, its religion, its culture, or anything about it very much themselves. So they've invented these jingly cartoon versions of it. I have a passport which has all these pictures of some tourist sites in it, which are supposed to represent British patriotism. It's not for me. I don't think they can face it because there are so many things they would have to if they wanted to reintroduce a real English or British patriotism would be contentious. And so they don't do it.
Do you think in principle the government has any business policing opinion under the rubric of non-violent extremism?
Absolutely not, in my view. And half of the problem about the use of terrorism by modern governments, particularly since 2001, but it was evident before, is that they do so much of the work of the terrorists. What terrorists want to do is they want to frighten governments and societies and into changing the way they behave. And the most obvious and startling example of this at the moment is, of course, the horrible pogrom and outrage in October last year in Israel by the Hamas bursting out of Gaza. This was plainly designed as a provocation, in my view, which has succeeded, I would imagine, beyond the dreams of those who designed it, in actually probably doing more fundamental damage to the state of Israel than any single action by anybody since 1948, because Israel did that stupid thing, which all adults are taught not to do quite early on, responded to provocation. And the responses to 2001 were the same. Instead of actually examining what had happened, realizing that no existential damage had been done to our societies, and thinking of a rational response, we rushed into homeland security, attacks on civil liberty, travel restrictions, and all kinds of panics, which I don't think have done any good at all.
So, do you think there's a broader sense, and you've written in the past about an established atheism in Britain and an attempt to force conformity on particular views on topics like gender and sexuality. Do you think there's a broader sense in which religious freedom is under threat in Britain from these trends?
Well, I'm still free to go to church in the way that I wish to do so, and I expect to be for some time to come. If, on the other hand, I worked in particularly a public sector place of work, and I wished to express my religion in public, or I allowed it openly to influence what I was doing, I think I would run pretty quickly into trouble. This is a marshmallow totalitarianism, in which there is no gulag, there is no secret police, but what there is there's a grave threat to employment, to anybody who won't conform, and also a grave threat to their being able to obtain the sort of education they want to obtain. So that's why I call it marshmallow totalitarianism. Nobody dies or is tortured or is beaten up or waterboarded for it, but the threat of losing your job or of having your career or your educational prospects destroyed, or those of your children, is a very powerful one, and it makes people conform. So religion becomes a private thing which isn't allowed to influence public actions. And that is, of course, what the enemies of religion like. They don't really mind what hymns I sing or what prayers I say, but they do very much mind what I do and what I oppose and what I support. So yes and no is the answer to that. But one of the great reasons for the success of the 1968 revolution is that the left learn. When they are defeated, they don't give up, they learn. So that didn't work. The objective of the great utopia, love, the beloved republic, which they've been working for really since 1848 and probably earlier, is still there. Its objectives are expressed differently and in some cases have been adjusted to take account of the fact that Karl Marx's fantasy and Lenin's fantasy of the working class led by a vanguard party is a ludicrous political idea. Now that's not going to happen, so you have to find some other way of obtaining power, which is why the work of Antonio Gramsci became so important among my Trotskyist faction round about the very beginning of the 1970s, when we began to realize that our attempts to create a working class vanguard party were a flop. They keep on coming back, and they're very, very good at finding new routes of attack, and their opponents, such as they are fantastically good at being provoked into stupid actions in which they can be made to look like stupid bigots. Into the elephant trap they tumble again and again and again. There is no serious opposition to this.
It's interesting that we've touched on what are often perceived as threats to religious freedom coming from the right, particularly under this anti-Islamic attitude. And we've also touched on issues that appear to come from the left regarding what you've referred to, people being fired for expressing controversial views in the public sector and so on. Is there anything that these two movements actually have in common? Is there something underlying both of these trends?
I tried, when I wrote my first book, The Abolition of Britain, which was an attempt to explain why the country in which I'd grown up had been so completely transformed during my lifetime up to 1999. I wrote it in 1999 when I was not yet 50. As you can see, I'm a lot older than that now. And I was trying to puzzle it out. I thought, naturally, as anybody does, seeing something which appears to be so inexorable, you think it must be driven by something. But I came to the view in the end that although you could trace all kinds of areas in which individuals had made very strong efforts to change the world, particularly one of the most amazing ones, the invention of the contraceptive pill for women was a political act. It wasn't an act of impartial science searching around. It was a deliberately encouraged piece of research by somebody who wanted the world to change in that way. But leaving that aside, what I thought and still think is that it was the failure of what had gone before and the vacuum which that left for other people to rush into that caused it. There isn't, although there are undoubtedly, and particularly there were in New Labour, politically organised people of the Euro-communist left with an objective. In general, the Cultural Revolution has proceeded because Christianity, and particularly in this country, Protestant Christianity, has simply collapsed. And something needed to take its place because there was a vacuum.
So we talked a great deal about tendencies that you view as negative and threats. Does the Church of England or religion in general still play any important positive or constructive role in Britain's public life?
Oh, the clergy, the individual clergy of the Church of England, each in their parishes, still do an immense amount of very good work. In many of the nastier parts of the country, they are the only remaining representatives of any sort of benevolent authority you can find. And they put up with a lot, and they're very brave. So from that point of view, the Church of England is an extremely valuable part of our society. The leadership of the Church is largely captured again by the new ideology. In my 1999 book, I went into the way in which they were persuaded to abandon what was central to them, which was their support for lifelong marriage. And they wrote a shocking document called Putting Asunder, in which they gave up defending lifelong marriage. And I think at that point, as an organisation and as an influence over the morals of the country, they were pretty much finished. But as I say, the individual parishes remain which are under considerable threat from the church bureaucracy at the moment, because they're expensive to maintain and they want to use the money on something else. There's a lot of good work done, and people should, just because you don't see it done, don't imagine it isn't happening.
And at the level of the state, does the fact that Britain still has an established church rather than an official doctrine of secularism serve any positive purpose?
No, it does have an official doctrine of secularism. Ever since the Equality Act of 2010, Christianity is just one religion which has the same status as all other religions. At that point, in law, formally, Christianity lost its primacy in this country. It had lost its primacy in the courts over many years before. There had been a lot of decisions. And you look at Victorian court buildings, either civil or criminal, and you'll find they're absolutely full of religious symbolism. The law courts in the Strand have got Moses halfway up and I think Jesus Christ on top. In the Old Bailey, the Central Criminal Court, there are quotations from the Psalms on the walls of the main hall. They were plainly Christian courts enforcing a Christian law, but especially since really the 1960s, the courts have increasingly and explicitly stated that they're no longer seeking to apply Christian principle in law, which was previously the basis not just of law but of politics. Before it falls down to the Houses of Parliament and see what an intensely religious building that is too. Pictures of saints. The very chimes of Big Ben are based on an air from Handel's Messiah. I know that my Redeemer liveth. The whole thing is a fundamentally, profoundly Christian building, but not much Christian now goes on in it. These things were removed bit by bit, and then, when the Equality Act was passed, they were formally removed, and this is no longer officially a Christian country. And the idea that there should be a daily act of Christian worship in state schools has, of course, simply been abolished by sloth. It's just not enforced. Nobody does it.
Just a final question on the domestic front before I hand over to Fez. There are some writers who are not necessarily Christians, like Tariq Madood, who've argued that although Britain may not be Christian in law or in substance, the very fact that there is a church that is part of the state does at least ward off some of the policies you see in France, for example, of the attempt to really expunge all signs of religion from the public square. Is there any truth in that at all?
Yes, but it doesn't make much difference, really. I don't think French secularism is not really much less militant than ours. In effect, I mean, there's an unwillingness to mention. I mean, there was a tremendous case of a few years ago of a French police officer who gave his life literally for hostages in one of those awful, I think it was a supermarket, and he actually exchanged himself for the hostages, and he was then killed. And he was a practicing Christian, and in the great commemorations of him, which the French state then held, there was never one single mention of his Christian faith, and the whole thing, even though it was the central thing about him and about the event, they wouldn't mention it. That kind of stupidity is still part of French government. But in this country, you'd be hard put to find a police officer who was comparable to this one. So which way would you have it? I don't know. I don't think there's much difference, honestly. It's nice to have it, but the problem is that you then get people saying, well, of course, this is a theocracy because there are some bishops in the House of Lords. They should go and watch those bishops in the House of Lords, see how they speak, see how they vote, and then come back and tell me it's a theocracy. Because it just isn't true, and it allows people to say this. It's one of the best arguments against establishment there is that this happens. But I don't think it makes very much difference.
Actually, I'll just ask you another question on domestic issues, because I enjoyed listening to you, but do you think it's possible, without the robust presence of a state church, for there to be a party in this country with a genuinely conservative, socially conservative ideology?
No, I think you could easily have such a party. I don't think a strong church needs to be a state church. In fact, I think it's probably a mistaken description to call the Church of England a state church. It's an established church, but on many occasions since its establishment, it has diverged from the state, and the state has diverged from it. And certainly, really, since the end of the 19th century, it hasn't functioned in any way as that. It's quite possible to imagine the development of some kind of Christian religious revival from outside the Church of England. In fact, it's probably more likely to come from outside the Church of England than from within it. So, no, I don't think that's really a crucial part of it. You can't, the future is unknown to us. I find it very difficult to believe that we're on the edge of a Christian revival in this country. But on the other hand, all kinds of other things have happened which I didn't think would happen, such as the collapse of the Soviet Union. So maybe it's just incubating there, waiting to happen. Maybe on my way home I'll see the first signs of it.
Well, that brings us over to the foreign policy discussion quite nicely, speaking of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I want to talk to you about war, in particular the two that have dominated the national conversation.
Can I, before I say anything else, can I make sure, can everybody hear me? Because it's absolutely awful if someone comes up afterwards and says, Mr. Hitchens, I'm sure what you said was very interesting, but I couldn't hear a word of it. And I'm afraid I'm very rude when this happens. I say, well, then you should have said so at the time. It's no use. I can't say it all again now. So I'm just checking. Sorry.
For the sake of those people, this is also being recorded. So if you didn't hear Peter, you can hear him later. So the two wars which have dominated the national conversation have been Ukraine and Gaza. So starting with the case of Ukraine, the national discourse around this is quite emblematic of a broader tradition where we neglect to talk about our pragmatic interest, and instead we talk about our involvement in war as part of some broader Western ideology. So firstly, why do you believe that Putin initiated this war? Do you think that he's an ideologue? Do you think that it was kind of geopolitical calculation about the expansion of NATO?
Well, of course, I cannot know his inner mind, and I won't pretend to do so. I will say what evidence there is, and there are two aspects of this. One is the writings of Robert Kagan, one of the Russia hawks, most principal Russia hawks in Washington, D.C., and in fact married to Victoria Nuland, who, as a very senior official at the State Department, was profoundly involved in the events in 2014, which led, in my view, to the Ukraine crisis as it now is. And he said in Foreign Affairs, around about the time of the Putin invasion, that it was quite obvious that Russia had been provoked. He didn't offer this as an excuse, because it isn't an excuse. If I'm in a pub and some moron comes up to me and tries to provoke me into a fight, I would be a fool to respond, just as Putin was a fool and worse than a fool to respond to the provocation. But there's no question but that the policy of the United States, particularly George W. Bush's declaration of support for Ukrainian membership of NATO I think, my date's go funny about this, it was the Bucharest summit of, I think, 2008, and the various other things which the United States has done in installing what it calls missile shields in Europe and adjusting and withdrawing from various treaties it signed at the end of the Cold War, have tended to make Russians think that they are the object of a major diplomatic assault. Anybody who knows anything, I mean, we're so Anglo-centric in our study of even events which don't happen here. If you know anything about the European wars of the 20th century, you will know that both the First and the Second World Wars were principally about Ukraine. This is and about the conflict, the enormous boiling conflict between Russia and Germany, which was then underway and which has now taken a new shape. And Ukraine is a cockpit. And we don't seem to understand that what an area of tension is or how vitally important its control might be to Russia. So in this country, the understanding of and knowledge of Russia is pathetic, except among experts. Basically, it's a country where they have some snow and some bears and funny writing, and they're bad. And that's about the limit of most British public knowledge of Russia. Honestly, that's about it. It goes no further, and anybody who panders to that will generally get a round of applause for saying these wicked Russians and so on and so forth, and how aggressive they are. So I think that the other thing, and this goes right the way back to George Kennan's warning in the early 1990s, I think it was, that NATO expansion was the most stupid policy that could conceivably be adopted. Most of you will know, but some will not. George Kennan was the architect in the State Department in the 1940s of the policy of containment of the Soviet Union, which ultimately succeeded. No one could describe him as any kind of Kremlin shill or Russian agent. He was a loyal servant of his country who knew and understood the Russian and above all the Soviet threat. And he came out of retirement when NATO expansion was going through the Senate and said, this is the stupidest thing you could possibly do, and it will lead to nothing but trouble. And so there's a long line of perfectly respectable, non-pro-Russian people who understand that shifting Western power and NATO particularly into Ukraine, a very contentious piece of territory, was a dangerous thing to do, and it might easily go wrong. The other things people keep telling me, they say, well, these speeches which Putin made before the invasion, he said he wanted to revive the Russian Empire. He said, and I've said to them, well, I once had this long argument on Twitter with someone who'd once been editor of The Economist. I said, can you please point me to the passage in the speech in which he says these things, which he says, because this is what the BBC says he says, it's what the Times says he said, but can you just point to me these passages where he says these things? And there was a bit of spluttering, and then silence fell, because he doesn't say. What he actually says is something more complicated. And I will explain it to you. I'm not, in explaining it to you, making it as a case. I'm stating it as a fact of what he said. What he said was the history of Ukraine is that, particularly since the Second World War, is that it was not a country but a republic of the Soviet Union, with no true autonomy, that It contained, because of various decisions taken by people Putin actually hates. He hates Lenin and the Soviet Communist Party. It contained parts of the Soviet Union which were not Ukrainian. And these notably, you'll have read about this, the Don Basin particularly, and absolutely Crimea. And that his view is, and it's quite clearly expressed, it seems to me, his view is that if Ukraine wishes to become an independent country, well, that's all well and good. Ukraine voted by an enormous popular majority in 1991 to become independent, and therefore it's entitled to be independent. But it shouldn't take with it any more than it had before it entered the Soviet Union. And basically, he's saying it's taken with it areas which are not really Ukrainian. Now, I'm not making this case, because it's not my business to make this case. I'm saying that's more or less what he says. The idea that Putin, who is perfectly well aware that his army has been unable to take Kharkov, which is 19 miles from the Russian border, the idea that he's preparing an assault on Vienna, Berlin, Prague, Warsaw, and will fetch up at Calais any time in the near future with his corrupt and incompetently led and ill-equipped army is a fantasy of propaganda. This isn't his aim, and if it were, he couldn't accomplish it. If you want to know what he's about, then what he's about is saying, well, okay, if Ukraine's going to be in NATO, if Ukraine's going to be in the West, then what it cannot be is the size and shape it is at present. Now, so I'm not advocating this. This is much more what he's saying than what he is portrayed as saying. And I think the portrayal of him as a new Hitler, which I addressed in a book I wrote some years ago called, which I foresaw, I believe, strong tendencies in the British and American establishments to seek conflict with Russia and Iran, was that he's a wicked man. He's a sinister tyrant. I mean, there are cases where, under his own personal control, people have been effectively tortured to death in his prisons. And I don't make any case for him. He's a terrifying despot. So don't again get me wrong here. But he is not as he's portrayed. And Hitler wasn't just a terrifying despot. Hitler was an ideological utopian leader. Putin has no ideology except Russian patriotism. And that's all. There isn't anything else there. He hates, as most Russians who went through the Soviet era do, he hates the Communist Party. He doesn't want it back. He doesn't want the Soviet Union back. And he's constantly misleadingly quoted by people who wish to suggest that it isn't true. And a small anecdote here. When I worked in Moscow in the 1990s, I had as both a friend and colleague a man called Igor Monichev, who died last year. Igor was a very funny man. He occasionally drank a bit too much. His father had been a nuclear submarine captain in the Soviet Navy. He was well inside the Soviet establishment, and he understood how it worked, and he also understood about defense matters. I went back to Moscow some years ago when they started having military parades again in Red Square, because they used to have them in the Soviet Union when they stopped. And Igor and I watched this parade together. It must be something in the region of 17 or 18 years ago. And we watched all this stuff trundling by. And he then turned to me and he said, "So what do you think of our display of strategic scrap metal?" And I think you have to understand that there were some modern weapons on display, but they probably only had about 10 of them in the whole country. Most of the stuff was decrepit, and a country as corrupt as Russia is, and it's almost as corrupt as Ukraine, which is saying something. A country as corrupt as Russia, if you're going to you give an order that 1,000 million rubles are going to be spent on Project X, how many of those rubles do you think will ever actually reach Project X, and how many of them will disappear into the trousers of generals and contractors and everybody else before it gets there? It's an enormous amount. It just goes. They haven't got the capacity to have the sort of armed forces that well-run Western countries can have because of the corruption. So I wouldn't worry too much about it. I wouldn't want to live next door to them, but I think we overdo it because I think there's capacity. And let's say they haven't, Kharkov, 19 miles from the Russian border. They couldn't take it.
So would that be an argument then in favour of a position which I know that you don't hold, which is that given the level of corruption, the weakness of the economy in Russia, that the West could conceivably continue to fund the Ukrainian war effort for years to come?
I think it's possible. I mean, there are certainly people who wish to do it. And there it is. I think the level of, at the moment I say anything at all critical about Western policy on this, I'm immediately called, sometimes by quite serious people, I'm immediately called a traitor and an agent of the Kremlin and a useful idiot and all kinds of other, what Tom Lehrer once called in another context, quite a variety of unpleasant names. And that's all I get. It's very, very rare for me to get somebody who's prepared to debate me on it because nobody wants to. Parliament has never held a proper, informed or intelligent debate on it, nor has the BBC, and nor is it likely to happen. So here we are, trundling on to in a war which could settle in incessantly, going this way and that, but not ever resolving itself. Maybe somebody wants that. I certainly don't. I mean, I've seen what a human body looks like after a bullet's passed through its head, and I don't find this at all satisfying. I'm not a pacifist, but I am very much someone who thinks that war is disgusting and should be avoided at all costs. And when it started, people should work to stop it. There's a great contrast, isn't there, between Western public opinion saying this bombardment of Gaza is appalling. We see daily the deaths of innocent civilians. Why doesn't it stop? And the contrasting public opinion in Ukraine, look at the wicked Russians, why don't we pour more weapons into this so more people can die? The views are inconsistent. Mine is consistent. I want them both to stop. I think they're both hateful and disastrous for almost everybody involved. And I like the people of both these regions, and I don't like seeing them become dead.
So what do you think is the ideological source or the rationale for people to label you as an appeaser for suggesting there should be a negotiated settlement?
Oh, well, appeasement. It's like treason, isn't it? Appeasement doth never prosper, for if it prosper, none dare call it appeasement. And the biggest single act of appeasement in modern history was the Yalta settlement, which gave me my childhood and teenage years and middle age and old age in a period of peace and prosperity, because we sacrificed the peoples of Eastern Europe for our own peace and comfort. And shocking. And had we, in the summer of 1939, had we been prepared to appease Stalin when we and the French sent a large military delegation to Moscow, maybe we would have got Stalin to come in on our side in the Second World War earlier and change the course of history. The whole slogan of land for peace in Israel, which was very common after Israel captured Sinai, is another way of expressing appeasement. What was Israel was being asked to exchange actual territory for paper promises. That's again what appeasement is. And the greatest act of appeasement by my own country in recent years is the surrender to the Irish Republican Army in 1998, in which in return for them ceasing to bomb London, we put them in political power, allowed them to raise money in the United States, and released all their prisoners. And that's appeasement, if you like, but nobody calls it that. So I'm content to be called appeaser if that's what people want, but I'm not actually. I think that it's very difficult redrawing borders, but people are rather hypocritical about it. There was a lot of Western support for what happened in Kosovo, for instance, which has led to the redrawing of in fact, the whole of Tito Yugoslavia has been redrawn as a result of, in my view, of strong Western intervention. Nobody complains about that. And of course, Turkey still sits in northern Cyprus, which it's now, I think, been occupied for 50 years. NATO member. Do you know you can't be expelled from NATO, by the way? There's no mechanism for it. Not that they've ever tried. But a NATO member sits illegally on territory which it seized in northern Cyprus half a century ago, and nobody does anything about it. So I then got accused of something called whataboutery. And before we go any further, can I give a defense of whataboutery? It's in the Bible. I can never quote these things direct, but basically, before attempting to pluck out the mote that is in thy brother's eye, take out the beam that is in thine own. It's perfectly reasonable to accuse people of hypocrisy when they are saying, you shouldn't do this, this is disgraceful, and are doing it themselves. I find there's so much of it about. In Syria, there's a huge amount of, I get accused, and this is again demonstrably falsified, I get accused of being an apologist for the Assad regime, which I'm on record as not being for decades. But the Assad regime is horrible, and nobody denies it. But in what way is it more horrible than the regime in Egypt, which, confronted with large Muslim Brotherhood demonstrations in Cairo, machine-gunned them, leaving hundreds of people dead on the streets? And yet this is a government with which we have friendly relations and don't criticize. So if our ostensible reason for being hostile to Russia is that it's an unpleasant dictatorship, then why aren't we hostile to China? If our reason for being hostile to Syria is that it has a leader who massacres his own people, then why aren't we hostile to Egypt? Because these are not the real reasons why we do these things. And here's the great contrast of the modern world. In 1989, two great empires were confronted with the challenge from their peoples demanding freedom. One in Tiananmen Square, where the government simply gunned down the protesters and rolled tanks over them and killed them and doesn't even mention it. And the other, the Soviet Union, confronted with great popular movements, particularly in East Germany, demanding their freedom, and they let them have it. And the consequences of that for the two countries involved was that Russia became a despised pariah state and China is our best friend. You work it out, because I absolutely can't.
Moving on to the Israel-Gaza situation, does Israel's conduct in Gaza make its safety or even its continued existence as a state more precarious? And if so, what actions must we take in the West to ensure its continued safety?
I don't know whether anything can be done. I mean, who's going to listen to me? I'm a columnist for the Mail on Sunday in London. When this began, I said that what Netanyahu should do after the dreadful pogrom was nothing, was to stand there and say the following. What you see here, this frightful butchery, is nothing to do with a two-state solution or how we treat the Palestinian people on the West Bank or the details of the non-implementation of the Oslo Agreement or anything. This is nothing to do with that. This is because they hate us and they want to kill us. And we're not going to respond. And it was a point, for many years of my life, I mean, going back into the 60s, Israel was a popular country, not just in the United States, but in Europe. It was seen as David to the Arab Goliath. And the general view was that Israel was a cause worth defending. I think there was even an Israeli singing duet, Esther and Abi Ofarim, who were fantastically popular and got into the Western charts. It was like that, in contrast to the recent events at the Eurovision Song Contest. Israel was a popular country. Everybody loved it. And since 1967, for one reason or another, this has drained away. And it's, in Europe, I think, politically, Israel's cause is pretty much lost, largely. It has for some time, but because of the, up till now, the very strong American support for Israel, that hasn't mattered so much. But that, I think, is rapidly passing away now. And without strong American, I mean, you could always rely on the Democratic Party supporting Israel in the United States. Not so now. So I see, I think, almost certainly, once this is over, very, very strong pressure from Washington on Israel of a Madrid or Oslo type to reach an agreement, pressure which Israel will be in no position to resist because it won't be able to afford to resist it, and because a really, really critical American government will genuinely threaten to withhold aid and arms in such a way that Israel will have to cave in. And I don't think this will necessarily lead to good things. So, yeah, I think it's probably unrescuable and catastrophic. I hope not, but it must be one of the stupidest things ever done. And you have to ask why. I am on record, and I will defend this if asked, in writing that before this, Benjamin Netanyahu was actually one of the less belligerent and militant leaders of Israel, having served with some distinction in the army. He's not impressed by generals. He knows there's no such thing as a surgical strike. He had gone through the motions. But the problem with Israel, for me, and this is a digression which I'd like to put, because maybe people here who want to contest it with facts, there is a river of fire which runs between the Israeli left and the Israeli right, going back to incidents such as Deir Yassin and the days of the Stern Gang and all the rest of it, but it's really, really fierce. When Yitzhak Rabin was murdered, his family did, as is in that part of the world universal, they opened their house to mourners to come and visit. And among those who came to Yitzhak Rabin's house to mourn his death was Yasser Arafat, an open anti-Semite, an admirer of the appalling Haj Amin al-Husseini, who had actually said in his life that he had no use for Jews. But he was welcome. A phone call was made to the office of Benjamin Netanyahu, in which he was informed in no uncertain terms that he better not show his face at the Rabin house. They would have Arafat, but they would not have Netanyahu. Now, I think it is more than possible that this attitude by the Israeli left towards Netanyahu has pushed him further and further and further into relying on the sort of Ben Gvir area of Israeli politics, which has led to this. I think it's been a grave mistake. I'd be interested if anybody with knowledge of Israeli politics wanted to contradict it to me, but it is part of the tragedy that they simply won't, the people who could have restrained him wouldn't coalesce with him, and as a result, he's ended up with these, frankly, indefensible people in a cabinet where they should never be. But it's a catastrophe for anybody who has, and I have been a defender of, critical defender, as you have to be, a defender of Israel's existence for many, many years. For anyone in my position, it's very, very difficult to watch this.
Do you think that attitude of the Israeli left towards Netanyahu in particular influenced what he's now admitted that his active efforts to stifle the implementation of the Oslo Accords between 96 and 99?
Well, I don't think, no. I think it was the Oslo Accords were never welcome to an awful lot of Israelis, and I don't think they would have worked. Imagine, it's hypothetical, but not all that hypothetical, and most of you will probably, through study of this, be quite familiar with the geography of the region. Imagine if a two-state solution eventually came about, and the Oslo Agreement to be fully implemented and moved on to that. Where would its border run? Well, it runs smack through the center of the former Palestine Mandate, actually through parts of Jerusalem, close to the most densely populated areas of Israel, of course the center of the operating Israeli economy. And the distances in Israel are extremely short. I don't know if you've been, but it really is a matter of a very few miles at some points, just simply to cross the country. Nothing is far. Now imagine if, there having been a two-state solution, that the Arab state then fell under the control, not necessarily of Hamas, but of somebody like them, and that they commenced to use their sovereign state, in which Israel no longer had any power to intervene, except by starting a war. They used their sovereign state as a base of the kind of actions which Hamas used Gaza for all the time. It would be intolerable. It's unworkable. I'm against it. I have my own complicated and tedious views about a better approach, which I won't trouble you with, but I just don't think it was ever workable. And I think that a lot of people, actually an awful lot of people on the Israeli left, accepted that after Arafat's second intifada. They thought Arafat simply could not be trusted. And there is a huge problem here. Any leader of the Arab people in that region who makes a deal, a really sincere and permanent deal, how safe is he?
So I've heard you make this argument before, and you've described a situation that would be preferable to a negotiated two-state solution being a kind of informal peace.
Yes. I think it would work. I think it could be made to work.
Is that still achievable given?
No, probably not.
Situation?
This is one of the many, many disasters of what's happened recently. I think it's probably, if it is achievable, it's so far away, it's not even worth talking about. I think it was achievable. I think that the desire to achieve neat, rounded off, political, signed solutions, particularly in very contentious territorial problems, is almost invariably a mistake. I think the goodwill between the peoples can actually, under certain circumstances, be quite considerable. And I think that my real concern, ever since I don't know how many times I've been there, but ever since I began to know what it was really like, has not been for formal negotiations or deals, but for the actual conditions of the people. And my desire is that every man should sit under his own vine and under his own fig tree, and none shall make him afraid. And to do that, you have to stop making things contentious, and you also have to stop constantly repeating. You must know people like this. You ring them up and you say, can you do such and such? And they say yes, and then they don't do it. The people who promise and don't fulfill do an immense amount of damage. We've had an awful lot of promise and very little fulfillment in this region, really, since 1948.
Speaking of British foreign policy more generally, you've spoken at length about the decline of Britain as a great power and the belief that we still are one. To what extent can Britain have an independent foreign policy today, or do we is it in our interest to just go along with the US imposed status quo?
We have an independent foreign policy about us. We could say we could stop people pushing us around in our own immediate sphere. We could make ourselves safe from conquest quite easily by accepting that we're a medium-sized country, quite rich, with many blessings, but not all that much money, sitting off the coast of northwestern Europe. But instead we live this sort of national Walter Mitty fantasy that we're a world power. Maintaining this, we actually still maintain, or maybe we don't, but we pretend to maintain what is actually a superpower Cold War nuclear deterrent. And it's an extraordinary thing. I mean, quite possibly, all the submarines are actually penned up somewhere in a harbour somewhere where nobody can find them, covered in cobwebs, and we don't send them out at all. We just pretend we're doing it because it's so fantastically expensive to do this ludicrous thing. I don't know. That wouldn't be a bad policy in my view, but it is absurd to imagine that we're a great power. And in any case, nuclear weapons are unusable by civilized nations. They just are. And if you ever come to the point where you need to use them, then you don't need to use them because you've already lost the point. So it's an absurdity, that too, and the mere expense of that keeps us from doing all kinds of things we ought to do. And then there's the absurd grandiosity of these two aircraft carriers, which we possess, which keep conking out, and also most of the aircraft on them, when they eventually get to sea and don't conk out, most of the aircraft on them are actually borrowed from the United States Marines because we haven't got enough. So you have aircraft carriers and no planes. I mean, it's comically absurd. It's a country which simply cannot actually live up to its. I've described it as being like a man who spends all his money insuring himself against alien abduction, but neglects to insure himself against fire and theft. That's what we do in defence. And then we go around the world. Lord Cameron of Chipping Norton, or Lord Slippery of Tripoli, as I prefer to call him, goes and stands about in his lovely suits saying grand things. But who cares? What does it matter to people what Britain says? What have our principal acts of foreign policy, acts of foreign policy in the past 20 years have been the illegal invasion of Iraq and the disastrous invasion, the disastrous bombing of Libya, which has contributed probably more than anything else to the destabilization of Europe, let alone poor old Libya, if you care about that.
Well, as a political think tank hoping to contribute towards better foreign policy, I'll hope that there is...
The point about foreign policy is, I mean, Austria has a foreign policy, and it's devoted to the well-being of Austria. Britain has a foreign policy which is devoted to sort of mental treatment of people who ought to be in the political asylum, who think that we're powerful. It performs no other function. It certainly doesn't make us safer, or stronger, or more prosperous. And yet it's very hard to question it. People will say, no, we're still a great country. We're still number 7 in GDP. Well, we are, or something like that. But if you measure it GDP per head, which is the real measure, we're a lot lower now on the charts. We're in the null point region if you measure it GDP per head.
Well, I think that is as good a time as any to hand over for questions from the audience.
If you guys do have questions, please feel free. Please make sure and introduce yourself a little bit, and then you can start with the question. We'll take 2 at a time, I think.
Oh, please don't do that.
Okay, fine.
Should I tell you why? It was developed by Alistair Campbell so that Blair wouldn't have to answer either of the questions. One at a time.
One at a time.
Well, that's all right.
I don't know if you want to mic me for the video.
I'll repeat your question after you ask it.
Okay, you said right at the beginning that it was a conceivable future that Europe would become Islamic. By what mechanism would that happen?
So the question is, by what mechanism could Europe become Islamic?
I don't know the future, but there are elements in our society now. First of all, there are now quite a large number of Muslims settled in our society who will continue to grow in number for various reasons. Secondly, Islam. Secondly, as I say, I think there is a very strong possibility of a religious revival as the material hopes of the early 21st century fade, and that Islam is very well positioned to benefit from it. It's, by comparison, Christianity, apart from anything else, an extremely easy religion to comprehend. Christianity is actually quite hard. It has many doctrines which people struggle over, and is I think not so easily apprehended. So I think that if it ever, if there ever were a religious revival, I think it would appeal to a lot of people. It has a powerful simplicity to it. That's it. I mean, it's speculation, but I think it's worth thinking about, and I say it because people should think about it. And if you might want it to be the case. I mean, there doubtless will be people in this room who would like Europe to be Islamic. And I think, on the other hand, there are a lot of Muslims I've met in this country who wish this country were more Christian. They find its atheistical ignoring of rules and morality worrying and frightening and unpleasant. So that's up to them what they think about that. They're entitled to think either of those things. But I think that it is a possibility, and if you don't or do want it to happen, then you need to think about it. But I can't possibly. The future is. I don't even know what will happen between now and when my hand hits that table. I might have missed. So it's just not possible to go into any more detail than that.
Gentleman at the back, you had a question, I think?
Sure. My name is Azim, DPhil student in politics here at the university. In the absence of other questions, my previous interview you had with former Deputy Prime Minister of Australia recently. This is in the last few months.
Yep.
And I was just been following your work for some time, and I'm interested in why you think the way certain things are. And I was interested in your conversation with him. You discussed the Israel-Gaza situation and provided some explanations as to why you.
Sorry, we've got a microphone problem, but keep going.
Keep talking.
Keep at it, then we can sort it out.
Right.
Thank you for your question. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just interested to know more about your support, the basis of your support for Israel's right to exist, and you based it on the, as far as I could tell, the unique crime of the Holocaust. That was my interpretation of what I heard.
Yeah, that's about right.
I was just wondering, so I can understand that and I can empathize with that. What I'm curious about is why, or how you, in your view, you then think about why the Palestinians or the people who inhabited that land ended up paying the price, if you will.
Yeah. So the question, just for the recording, is what's the basis for Israel's right to exist, and why should Palestinians pay a price if they do?
Yeah. I don't really believe in rights to exist.
Me too.
I think that fundamentally it's an absurd concept. Nations come into being and they either stay in being or they don't, depending on actually in many ways how they subsequently behave and how well they. Sometimes it's beyond their control. Empires fall, empires rise, nations come, nations go. The map of Europe is evidence of that. On this particular issue, I think that when we all know of the many cynical explanations of the Balfour Declaration, and there's some truth in them, and we all know that Britain wanted very much to have a colony which would term a mandate in that part of the world. We probably know the interesting history of how much bigger it originally was, and then how the French, how did this go? The French didn't want Faisal to be king of Syria, so they booted him out of Syria, and we then gave him Iraq, whereupon we had already given Iraq to somebody else, and Abdullah, I think it was, and he was very cheesed off that he hadn't got Iraq anymore, so he went and camped in what was quite near where Amman now is, and demanded a kingdom of his own, and they then cut off a sizable chunk of the Palestine Mandate and called it Transjordan. And this is the early history of this. This is the sort of thing that was going on. The whole thing was ultimately ratified in San Remo, the San Remo Accords, and became a League of Nations recorded treaty in which these title to the land, the last time there was international agreement on title to the land, and the San Remo Accords are quite interesting on what they say about what is now the West Bank, for instance. If you want to argue the law of who sits there, it's a complicated past, and most people don't know it. And then in 1948, Britain pretty much fled, because it had run out of money and run out of power, just as it ceased to try and interfere in Greece, and also at roughly the same time it was pulling out of India. We had become too weak. To give an instance of how different it had been, my father, who was an officer in the Royal Navy, had been on his way actually to South America in 1936, I think it was, the Abyssinia crisis, when his ship was turned around and brought back. And he ended up, to his astonishment, doing riot duty in Haifa in the Palestine Mandate in 1936, in the days when we still had a navy and we still had power and we still enforced it. And there was a very major British military operation against a fairly substantial Arab revolt. And the Arab revolt was largely directed against the continuing migration of Jews into the Palestine Mandate, which was a major controversy. And actually the Arab revolt was ultimately more or less successful, because in 1939 there was the famous white paper denounced by Winston Churchill, in which Jewish migration to Palestine was pretty much stopped at exactly the time when more Jews needed to get out of Europe than any other time in human history, which is probably one of the worst actions of British foreign policy ever, but it happened, and it's one of the reasons why what then went on to happen happened, and why the eventual expulsion, really, of British force from the Palestine Mandate in 1948 was so violent, why, bizarrely, it was communist countries, particularly Czechoslovakia, who armed the nascent Israel. The armed forces of what became Israel were largely armed with Czech weapons, because other people had begun to move in to interfere. So there are all kinds of elements in this history which make it complicated and difficult for everybody. And there was then a filthy war in which large numbers of people were brutally expelled from their homes. And at the same time, more or less the same time, this is not known to history, there's a tremendous book about it which I recommend everybody. I can't remember the name of the author, it won't stick in my mind, but the title will stick in yours and you should get hold of it. It's called Orderly and Humane. Orderly and humane, because those were the terms of the Potsdam Declaration under which it happened. Millions and millions of people, and these were not active Nazis, Hitler Youth members, these were women and children, civilian innocents who happened to be German, were violently, and I say violently with reason, violently expelled from Eastern Europe in huge numbers under the official policy of Britain and the United States in a totally shameful event for which there is no defense. And if you read the book, you will just be astonished at how savage it was. That happened. As I say, millions of people were displaced and massacred in what became India and Pakistan. After the expulsion of the Arabs from Mandate Palestine, very large numbers of Jews were likewise expelled from Arab and Muslim countries, often again with great savagery and deprived of the ability to take possessions with them. This was really quite brutal expulsion. So, of all these horrible crises, only one remains an open political question. I have to ask people why that would be. You can go further back if you like. Two major countries on the planet, three if you include New Zealand as a major country, have their origins in savage, exterminationist ethnic cleansing. An Irish friend of mine was quite shocked when we both lived in the United States when he actually went into what General Philip Sheridan, his, as it were, countryman, had done to the Native Americans in what were called the Indian Wars to clear the space for what has now become the United States. Same with Australia. This is, I'm afraid, horribly and regressively common in the history of man. Now the question is what you do when these horrors have happened. Is the wise thing to keep the dispute open? Is the wise thing to encourage those who were expelled and their descendants to believe that they will return to their lands? Does anybody seriously, for instance, suggest this to the many, and there are political movements which suggest this in modern Germany, the many Germans who are the descendants of people who were foully expelled from Eastern and Central Europe? Does anybody suggest that they should be returned to where they came from? Does anybody suggest a transfer of population from India, Pakistan? Does anybody ever say that the Jews expelled from the Arab and Muslim countries should go back to them? Because no, they don't. Because the practical, humane thing to do in these cases is generally to resettle. The same might be said of the horrible transfer expulsion of Greeks and Turks after the Second World War, which was the model for the Potsdam atrocity. These things happen a lot. And do we serve anybody's purpose? Do we make individual human beings more happy? Do we allow families to live in peace and prosperity in settled homes by encouraging rights of return? My own view is probably not. The other part of the case is very well made by Danny Finkelstein, who you possibly read in the Times as a columnist, who's recently written a memoir of his own extraordinary ancestry called Hitler, Stalin, Mom and Dad. Danny's grandfather was a German Jew, and he hated Zionism. Like many German Jews in the 1920s and 1930s, he thought that it was a grave mistake. It was very common among intelligent European Jews at the time. He thought Zionism was a catastrophic absurdity, cutting Jews off from the European mainstream, a defeatist failure to face what their future ought to be. He used to debate, he actually did in the days when the Weimar Republic existed, he would debate Nazis on this subject very fiercely, and he would beat them, and he would also debate his Zionists, and he would beat them too, because he was so eloquent. And then came really, I suppose, the true beginning of it was Kristallnacht in November 1938, when it was perfectly obvious to anybody that the actual Hitler government was interested in the murder of Jews. And from what happened from then on, Danny Finkelstein's grandfather, from being one of the most cogent, militant, unflinching opponents of Zionism, reluctantly accepted that actually it was an inevitability because Jews had to have somewhere to go. And actually, I don't think there's an answer to that. There's no excuse, and I offer none, for the massacres and cruelties, for the driving out of the Arab people from there. There just isn't any. I don't offer one because that's not what history is. Not a moral force. It's a series of events, and power operates as power operates, and we see it. And we have to try and work out from the way it's been used in the past how we can use it more intelligently and humanely ourselves. But I just don't think that trying to reopen this case is going to help. And I think when I went to Gaza, the one time I went, it's a fantastic site. It's a beautiful spot on the Mediterranean shore. It could be Dubai. There's no reason, apart from politics, why it shouldn't be. What I noticed, one of the things I noticed was that among the quality of the housing in Gaza before it was destroyed was pretty bad. In many cases, it was grievous to see the conditions in which people were living. And I saw one small thing which I thought was really rather moving, which is the United Arab Emirates had spent a great deal of money on building a new estate of modern blocks of flats for people to live in civilized circumstances. And I thought, hope. If only the Arab world would do this to Gaza, if only Hamas and its desire to use it as a base for war could be outflanked by the improvement in the lives of the people which would transform the city into a civilized place then. But of course, go on. But that sort of thing, the improvement in the lives of the people, seems to me to be on the end of sloganizing, the end of promises of return, the end of the fanning of the embers of ancient quarrels, just seems to me to be better for the people. And aren't all of us interested in politics and interested in these affairs because we actually want people to live better?
Hi there. Thank you very much, Zembaru. So my question is this: if we were sat here 106 years ago, the Balfour Declaration was made, as you know, to Lord Rothschild, and in that the government set out their sympathy designs project. But interestingly, one of the conditions of that support was that the civil and religious rights of the non-Jews should not be prejudiced.
Indeed.
So, given what you also said, clearly that condition subsequent was not fulfilled. So, with this, the title of the talk is British politics broken, religion war, Britain's broken political compass. My question is, British Zionism, the necessary condition for British Zionism, and actually maybe 160 years ago most of us would have supported that vision, that yes, there should be a Jewish homeland, but with that very important condition, that the civil and religious rights of the non-Jews...
Yes, well, can I be technical here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I just finish the question?
Oh, sorry, yeah, please.
My question is, I think fundamentally, do you think British Zionism, being British and being a Zionist, in my mind, is fundamentally incompatible, given that that critical condition of support was completely broken?
So the question is, given that the condition originally placed in Britain's support for Zionism, that the civil and political rights of the Arab population be respected, doesn't appear to have been maintained, is there now a contradiction or hypocrisy in Britain continuing to support Israel?
Yeah. Well, you have to distinguish between the Palestine Mandate, which was a colony with a governor run by Britain, and the State of Israel, which was a country set up after the war we've been discussing, and deriving nothing from British power. And also you have to look at the wording. The Balfour Declaration doesn't suggest the setting up of a Jewish state, but of a national home, a dwelling place. And I think, if you look at there's a particular character in the British Mandate administration called Ronald Storrs, to whom the world owes one very important thing. He made the law which decrees that no new building can be built in Jerusalem unless it's faced with Jerusalem stone, which is a major step in civilization, and saved the city from a certain amount of vandalism. But he was also, as were an awful lot of the people in the British Mandate administration, really not very keen on the idea of Zionism and wanted to restrain its growth. And there was a great deal of ambiguity in the British administration about this. Many of them were Arabists. Many of them thought it was unfair on the Arabs. But the colony mandate of Palestine was not a democracy. And it was, the rights that it maintained were, I would say, reasonably equally granted to all inhabitants. To compare that with the state of Israel, which was specifically a Jewish state afterwards, is, well, even to give it continuity with it is, I think, a mistake. Nobody intended, when Britain moved into Jerusalem, when Allenby took Jerusalem, and we took that land from the Turks, Britain still imagined that its empire would continue to exist for hundreds of years. There was absolutely no intention of finding ourselves where we were in 1948, having to scuttle from the region because we couldn't afford to stay. So I don't think you can blame it on the Balfour Declaration, or really use the Balfour Declaration as a point of criticism. A Jewish state is obviously not going to be as kind to non-Jews as it is to Jews, because it's a Jewish state, which it isn't. I mean, do come back with a supplementary if you feel I've dodged you, because I don't think I have, but you look slightly miffed.
I mean, well, as in like the whole, I mean, from my understanding, like I'm not in politics or history, I'm in finance, so, you know, I'm trying to learn and understand.
I mean, I'm in journalism, for goodness sake.
Well, yeah, but pretend but no, as in, my understanding was, you know, Britain fundamentally did support that vision, and that was, you know, the reason why Britain now continues to do that. I mean, partly because I think Britain, I mean, I view Britain's relationship, well, Britain views its relationship with the US more importantly than anything else, and it's having to basically toe the line with the US.
There's something in that.
Philosophically, where does the support for Israel come from?
Well, I don't think that you can actually say that Britain was particularly a supporter of a Jewish state in that part of the world, ever. I think that there were people in parts of the British administration who wanted that, but there were probably just as many, if not more, who were not. I think the 1939 White Paper was a great triumph for those people in the Colonial Office and the Foreign Office who did not want Jewish migration to continue into the Palestine Mandate. And though, of course, it was in some ways the cause of the growth of the absolutely ruthless branch of Zionism founded by Jabotinsky, which probably gave Britain more trouble in the period before 1948 than any other. And may also have created resentments and also created support for a Jewish state in the United States, which wouldn't otherwise have existed. It may have been a mistaken policy, but there's no question that the British administration was at the very, very least ambiguous about whether it wanted it wanted the Jews to dominate there. And somebody was asking what earlier on about paying prices and so forth. I don't believe in that, as I think people should be made to pay prices for the political mistakes of their predecessors. But sometimes is a case made that the Arab people of the region are not in any way responsible for the Holocaust. And it's not quite accurate, because one of the people promoted by the British administration in Jerusalem was Haj Amin al-Husseini. Do you know about him?
Briefly, yeah.
Yeah, he became Grand Mufti of Jerusalem against actually the wishes of the other Arab clans of Jerusalem who didn't like him, under British pressure. Now, Husseini became such a thorn in the side of the British administration that he fled, I think, to Iraq in the end, which was more or less fascist at the time, and ended up in Nazi Germany recruiting, this is almost unbelievable, but it's true, a Bosnian Muslim detachment for the Waffen-SS, because he was really not at all keen on Jews. And so there were people, very militant anti-Jewish people in some part, and then also there were others among the Arab community in that part of the world who were actually much more interested in compromising and working with the Zionists than you might think, and who favoured a civilized solution. Husseini wasn't typical, but he was there. So there were all kinds of things going on during the mandate, but the civil and political rights thing is also well worth examining in the Israeli treatment of the Israeli Arabs. The Arabs who stayed, who didn't leave in 1948, which is, again, quite complicated. But I think if you, in a private place, if you ask most Israeli Arabs whether they would prefer to live under an Arab government, they'd all say no.
Mustafa, I think we've got time for one more brief question.
Say you wish only to improve living standards in Britain as fast as possible, setting aside anti-materialism, concerns over civil liberties and so on. How would you do it?
So the question is, if your only goal was to improve living standards in Britain as fast as possible and there were no other considerations, how would you do it?
I'm sorry, that's a bit out of the usual questions.
Gosh. This is one of the reasons why I'm not standing for election this year. I think I've watched standards deteriorating for so long that I'm horribly aware of what an enormous task it would be to stop them from getting any worse rather than improving them. The most fundamental reforms that I would make in this country, if I had the usual 9 months of honeymoon in which to make them and a parliamentary majority of people who actually agreed with me, which is something out of Grimm's fairy tales, not likely to happen, would be that I would try to end the state attack on the married family and the huge pressure on both parents to go out to work, which is desperately bad for everybody. And that I would reform the education system so that you didn't need to be super rich to get your children educated properly. And I think the not immediate, but the short-term results of those two changes, the benefits of them to everybody involved would be huge and would create a foundation for a counter-revolution of the sort which I favour.
Okay, thank you so much, Peter. I think he's given us a lot to think about.